We're continuing in our tour of different types of studies with discussion of studies of diagnostic tests, which tend to be a little special and require some thinking to figure out whether a new diagnostic test is any good or not. So we're going to define what diagnostic tests are and why it's important to study them, talk about how we measure how good a test is and why accuracy is actually a really terrible metric as far as this goes. And we're finally going to define positive and negative predictive values, specificity, and sensitivity, which are the real metrics by which you want to judge any diagnostic test. Now, to introduce this whole concept to you, I am going to give you a test right now. It is 95% accurate. It is a personal test that I have invented to tell remotely whether or not you have Gilbert syndrome. Now, you may have heard of Gilbert syndrome, but in case you haven't, Gilbert syndrome is a benign condition that affects some people in the population, and it causes them to become slightly jaundiced, a little bit yellow in the eyes when they're in periods of stress or illness or something like that. And I'm going to give you a test to see whether you have Gilbert syndrome or not. Okay, ready? So stare directly into your screen. Here we go. Do you have Gilbert syndrome? I hope everyone's watching. No. Okay. How did I do? Well, I actually did really well. The prevalence of Gilbert syndrome in the general population is about 5%. 5% of people have Gilbert syndrome out there. I said no, which means that I'm 95% accurate, right? Because I am correct 95% of the time, simply by saying no all the time. So hopefully what you see is that this metric called accuracy, how often you're right in predicting whether the person has the disease or not, is pretty useless, because obviously a test that just says no all the time doesn't actually do anything for you. So there's got to be a better way. What's the better way? Well, to understand the better way, I have to introduce you to something called the 2x2 table, or the contingency table. It's often referred to as. Across the top, you have whether the new test, the new diagnostic test, is positive or negative. Every diagnostic test, I'll take that back, most diagnostic tests are interpreted in that binary fashion, yes or no. You get a test for a disease, yes or no, do you have it? There's also, on this side, the disease itself, okay? Do you actually have the disease? Because remember, the test isn't going to be perfect. In the upper left-hand corner, we have the true positives, patients who have the disease, and the test says, yes, they have the disease. That's pretty good. Upper right-hand corner, false negatives. The patient has the disease, but the test doesn't catch it. So they are falsely reassured. That's not great. Bottom left, the false positives. The test comes back positive. Yes, you're pregnant, but you're actually not pregnant. Also bad, okay? And then on the bottom right, the true negatives, the test comes back negative and you don't have the disease. By the way, pregnancy isn't a disease. I don't have to use disease here. Any outcome is relevant here. Okay, let's look at my Gilbert syndrome test and put some numbers to it. So what you can see here is that my test, if I tested on, let's say, 100 people, is always negative, all right? It always comes out negative. And 95 of those are true negatives, because out of 100 people, 95 people don't have Gilbert syndrome. That's the prevalence of the disease. And then 5 are false negatives. So my accuracy of my test is 95%. Accuracy is officially defined as the true positives plus the true negatives divided by the total results. So true positives, which is 0, plus true negatives, which is 95, divided by all my results, which is 100. So 95 over 100, 95%. Intuitively, accuracy is just how often you're right. And so many studies, particularly those that are put in the news media, say things like, this study diagnoses cancer with 99% accuracy. It's essentially meaningless if you don't know what the prevalence of the disease is. So whenever I see that word accuracy, it gets my hackles up. All right, what do you want if you don't want accuracy? What other metric is better? Well, there are a number, and it really depends what question you're asking. Often what you want is something called positive predictive value, which is if the test is positive, what are the chances that the patient has the disease? Okay, so you get a test for HIV, let's say, it comes back positive. What are the chances now that the patient really does have HIV? The Inverse of that is negative predictive value. If the test is negative, what are the chances that the patient really doesn't have the disease? And how good your test is might depend on what the disease is and how important it is to catch it. And really what your goal is with this test is what's called a screening test, where you kind of want to catch everyone with the disease, and it's okay if you get some people in there that don't have the disease because you're going to do more advanced testing later. Or is it a more targeted test where you want to be really sure that you are not falsely diagnosing people with the disease? So the positive predictive value of my Gilbert's disease test is essentially 0 because it's never positive. It always comes out negative. The negative predictive value of my Gilbert's disease test is 95. If you get negative on my test, you have a 95% chance of not having Gilbert syndrome. Of course, that's the population prevalence, so I didn't really tell you anything you didn't already know. Something to take home here, positive predictive value and negative predictive value, much like that accuracy, are changed based on the prevalence of the underlying disease. So it's sort of tied to the population you're studying. You might be more interested in assessing the test itself. What are the characteristics of the test regardless of the population prevalence of the disease, right? Just like how good is this test inherently? Well, those are concepts known as sensitivity and specificity. Officially, the sensitivity of test is, given that the person has the disease, how often will my test pick it up? Okay, so think of sensitivity. Think of the word sensitivity. How sensitive is my test? And the idea is that if the patient even has the slightest hint of the disease, the test is going to be positive, right? It's very sensitive. My Gilbert syndrome test has a sensitivity of 0% because it always comes out negative, right? Whereas a test that is highly sensitive would always come out positive, right? Just super sensitive, it always comes out positive. All right, specificity. Given the person does not have the disease, how often will my test be positive anyway? Okay, so it's positive. It's not very specific. It's going to be positive kind of no matter what. You have the disease, you don't have the disease. It's not specific to the disease. It's just a test to test whether you're alive or not or something like that, right? It's not very specific. So my Gilbert test specificity is 100% because it never comes out positive in a patient who doesn't have the disease, because it never comes out positive at all. So you have to interpret sensitivity and specificity together, and very often the more sensitive a test is, the less specific it is, right? So if the test is on a hair trigger, it's super sensitive, it's not very specific, it's going to turn up positive all the time. Conversely, the more specific a test is, it's really certain you have the disease before it comes out positive, it's often not very sensitive. It'll miss those people who have kind of a light form of the disease. So there's a bit of a trade-off here, and the best tests have high levels for both sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity and specificity are a property of the test itself. They should remain constant no matter what the population you're testing it in is. But positive and negative predictive value are going to depend on the underlying prevalence of the disease. So to drive this home, we're going to do some math, and I apologize, but this is not too much math. And I'm going to show you how an incredibly good test with very high sensitivity and very specificity can still give you very wrong results. Okay, so we're going to use an HIV test. And tests for HIV are extremely good. They have about 99% sensitivity and 99% specificity. So let's walk through a 2x2 table on the left here. And let's imagine we're testing a population of people in whom the prevalence of HIV is 5%. That's a very high prevalence, but you can imagine we're testing a high-risk group of people, like intravenous drug users or something like that. So let's say we're going to test 1 million people, and the prevalence of the disease is 5%, so that's 50,000 people that truly have HIV in this case, and then 950,000 who don't. Now, how is my test going to do? Well, I told you it's 99% sensitive. So it's going to pick up 99% of these 50,000 people. It's going to pick up 49,500 of them. Pretty good. And of course, it'll miss 500. Those are going to be some false negatives. We hate to have it, but no test is perfect. We're going to have some false negatives there. Now, I also told you it's 99% specific, which means that it's going to correctly say that 940,500 people don't have HIV. That's great. And then the difference, 9,500 people, it's going to falsely come out positive because it's not perfectly specific. Okay, so when we look at the positive tests here, we can see that there's about, I'll do the math, 58,000 positive tests that came out, and 49,500 of those 58,000 positive tests were true positives. That's the positive predictive value. So that's okay, right? But like, it's not great. It's not 99%, really. It's less than that. So what's going on? Well, let's take another example. Let's imagine we test a population where the HIV prevalence is super low, 0.001%. Imagine you're testing like people in a convent or something like that, okay? So we've got 1 million individuals, of whom 10 actually have HIV, and 999,990 don't. Well, my test is 99% sensitive, so I'm just going to round up and say we capture all 10 people with HIV with my 99% sensitive test. And there are no false negatives in this case. My test is also 99% specific, which means we're going to have 989,990 true negatives, so we're good, we're not worried about them, but we're not perfect. We're going to have 10,000, the difference there, we're going to have 10,000 false positives. Well, now, look, we've got 10,010 people who tested positive, of whom only 10 actually have HIV. So despite this test being amazing, 99% sensitive and specific, the vast majority of people who test positive are false positives. So the positive predictive value, that thing you're interested in when you're telling your patient how scared they should be with this positive test result, is affected directly by the underlying prevalence of the disease. So whenever you interpret a diagnostic test, you're not just looking at the result, you're looking at the underlying rate of disease in the people you're testing first. And the higher that underlying rate is, the more confident you are that a positive test is a true positive. The lower the underlying rate is, the more you got to worry that a positive test is a false positive. So the two examples that I gave you, the high and the low prevalence examples, are similar in one way. A patient who tests positive does have a dramatically increased risk relative to the baseline of the population. So even in that nunnery example, the people who tested positive, instead of having a risk of 0.001%, now have a risk of 0.005% or whatever. But so it is higher, but it's still very low on the absolute scale. Okay? So a positive test does increase your risk of having the disease from baseline, but if your baseline is incredibly low, it's incredibly low. Take-home points here. Diagnostic tests have to be interpreted in the context of the underlying rate of disease. Even very good tests may have low positive predictive value if the disease prevalence is low. So think about that when you're testing for rare diseases. Sensitivity and specificity are inherent to the test itself. They can tell you how good a test is, but remember, its performance is really going to depend on who you're applying the test to. Positive and negative predictive value are a result of how good the test is and the prevalence of the disease. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.